hard acts to follow. What I'm going to talk to you this morning about is kind of drawing on both of those earlier talks, a little bit about empathy for our customers, but also thinking about continuous improvement mindset as well and making incremental gains. And so I'm going to do that by looking at the way that we interact with our healthcare professionals through the lens of the prescriber sentiment and how we might be able to identify areas for improvement. So my name's Philip, I'm the head of marketing for HIV at Gilead. And before I dive in, I just want to give a big shout to Babette. Are you in the audience, Babette? Hello. So Babette's been my partner in producing the data that I'm going to share with you this morning. So this is data that is fresh, it's prepared explicitly for this meeting, and I think you'll find it really interesting. So, as some of you might know, the company that I work for, Gilead, is based in Melbourne. Give me a shout if you're based in Melbourne. Great, there's not too many of you. So I'm based in Sydney. And so I was down in the Melbourne office recently, sitting with a colleague over lunch, and they were complaining, as they often do, about the COVID lockdown period and a little bit about the scars and trauma that left them with. And I said to my colleague, look, surely there must have been some positives that came out of that lockdown period. And they said, yes, I'd spent more time with the family and picked up some good habits around exercise. And then they said, but, that's all gone now, back to the normal now. And so that kind of triggered me thinking that, for us in the pharma industry, we made a lot of changes over COVID. Some of them were really positive about how we interact and engage with healthcare professionals and the health system. So I started wondering about, what of those changes have stuck? How can we use some data perhaps to reflect on that time and guide our future practices to make sure that we're identifying the right things to keep and which to kill? And are we evolving with purpose, or are we just random companies fumbling around in the dark? So one such data set is channel dynamics, brought to us by IQVIA. So I imagine that many of you are familiar with this data set. So it's a really rich source of data that we certainly subscribe to and look at on a monthly basis. And it surveys healthcare professionals based on their interactions with pharma and collects a number of different data points around their experience. And then statistical methodologies scale that up to be a representative sample of the entire prescriber population. So it's got a few strengths that I think will prove important for this discussion. So channel dynamics is a large sample, particularly in the general practice space with over 600 prescribers involved. It's had a consistent methodology now for a pretty long time, and that allows us to take a step back. So normally we're seeing this data on a monthly basis, looking at the RQ, thinking about our company, our competitors, but it's quite interesting to take a chance to step back and zoom out and see what's happening on a more longitudinal basis. And there's two things that I want to look at particularly with you this morning, and that's engagement quality and the Net Promoter Score. So engagement quality is a measure of usefulness, and then the NPS, I'm sure, is familiar to most of you, but the key question here is, would you recommend this interaction to a colleague? So let's dive in. So we're going to look at there's 3 points that I want to make as we go through this data. That's around the interaction number and what's happening over time, what channel mix trends can we see, what impact that has had on prescriber sentiment, and then perhaps have a bit of a discussion about some potential causes for those changes and what opportunities that presents for us as an industry. So just take a moment to orientate you around this graph because we're going to stick with it for a while. So on the y-axis here, you've got the number of interactions. On the x-axis is time. And what we're looking at here is the total net number of interactions. So you can see my original hypothesis was that there was going to be a massive change over COVID, but actually we did a pretty good job of maintaining our interactions, particularly in the general practice space. However, this is the thing that really shocked me. It's down this business end here, where in the last 12 to 18 months there's been a massive uptick in the number of interactions, particularly in the general practice space as shown here, but we also looked at some specialist data as well, and you can see the trend is replicated. So given the strength of the general practice data set, that's where we're going to zoom in a little bit more. So if that's what's happening en masse, when we look across all channels, what is that doing to the perception of usefulness? And you can see here that there's actually been a pretty positive trend over time that is going upwards, and despite the number of interactions ticking upwards as well. However, and contrary to that previous finding, NPS has had a stark fall correlating with that massive uptick in number of interactions. So we've got a bit of a paradox here where prescribers are saying that the interactions are still useful but not recommending them to anyone. So let's take a minute. What do you think this is? Grab out your phones, because I'm still struggling to get my head around this. I'd be interested in your perspectives. So is this a case where the data's flawed, or there's a misunderstanding in the data, or there's something funky going on? So it looks like the people are saying that it's people, the GPs just don't like to recommend things. Keep on voting, I'm interested in it, because as I said, I'm curious to find out what you all think as well. So all about GPs not recommending things. Okay, so let's move on. So we saw that massive uptick in the sort of the sum of total interactions. Let's split that out and look at the different channels that are involved. So the channel dynamics data set defines traditional channels as the face-to-face, the phone call, the mail out, and the digital channels is, as we'd expect, emails, e-detailing, e-meetings. So any surprises here? What do you think? So what this would suggest is that drive upwards is purely coming from digital channels. So if that's the case, let's explore that a little bit further. Traditional channels looking at usefulness and NPS, things remaining relatively static. If we look at the digital channels, this is looking like what might be behind it. So we're seeing both here a slight fall in perception of usefulness, but a particular dip in NPS. So let's explore that by channel now. So here the channel dynamics data set provides the specific data of the different digital channels, and you can see, again, any surprises here? What's driving this uptick is our favorite channel of all, it's the email. So given that, let's have a look at the email in a little bit more detail. So usefulness, relatively consistent. Actually, we saw a good bump over the COVID period, but more recently it's dipping down again. But most importantly here, that NPS has taken a big fall. So if we're seeing this fall of NPS and this with this uptick in volume, I kind of was starting to wonder, what's behind this? Because the NPS, it's a funny old measure, right? It's a mathematical calculation, a sum of the detractors taken away from the advocates. So is this about the grumpy people becoming more grumpy, or the dissatisfied becoming even more dissatisfied? So let's have a look. The data would suggest not. So with this increase in volume, you can see that the red numbers there, those are the detractors, are taking up a much bigger proportion. So I was trying to thinking about, well, why are they still saying it's useful? If they don't want it, if they're not prepared to recommend it, why are they still saying it's useful? So then it took a bit of a dive into that, separating this data out by usefulness category. So here we've got shown on screen that on the far left, the people who believe these email interactions are very useful, looks relatively consistent. The mix looks pretty normal there, but it's this group in the middle. The grumpy people are still staying grumpy. The people in the middle who think things are somewhat useful are actually trending towards no longer recommending these email communications. It's quite stark, right? So you're probably thinking, biting your bottom lip, that might have been me. So, you want to see which companies are to blame for this? Like we could. So we've got some surrogate markers there. When we look at the different therapy areas, a couple of things leap out at me. So what we've got here is the different therapy areas, not naming any companies, thankfully. And you can see that, is there any one company behind this? The answer is no. It's all of us together that is behind this increase in volume. Except maybe for the systemic anti-infectives, and I'm looking at you, Pfizer. But the other thing that pulls out here is that look how much attention grabbing there is going on for the GP's inboxes. The GPs are just overwhelmed by emails coming from so many different therapy areas. And when we did look at the specialist data, this was one area that was quite different. With a cardiologist or a psychiatrist, they've got a much smaller number of companies that are trying to get their attention. But we know that the bulk of our work as an industry is in general practice. Let's just bear this in mind. How much attention is being sought from our communications? So maybe, is there a company or a therapy area that's doing okay in this? That, if we could look at this by NPS by therapy area, are there any front runners that we could perhaps learn from? And the bad news is no. Again, it's all of us together. The sum total of the different therapy areas is what's pulling this down. Okay, so onto the home straight now. What are the key takeaways from this channel dynamics data, at least from my perspective, is that we don't often take enough time to step back from longitudinal data sets and take lessons on how we can move forward, how we can evolve with purpose. Because we're normally looking at this kind of thing in the RQ, thinking about our drug, our competitor, our space. And my challenge is to you to take the lessons from the past and apply them to the future. Let's not evolve randomly. So we did see changes during the COVID period. That was my hypothesis, but I was really, really starkly hit by the changes that have happened in the last 12 months. Now where we see GP digital engagements are more than 3 times higher than that even of the COVID peak, when we had to really rely on digital channels for engagement, and that is driven by email. And as you've seen, that this is correlated with the fall in HCP sentiment. And we've already talked a little bit about the number of therapy areas that are vying for the GP attention, and that's intense. And we do see parallels there with the specialist data. So are there any other data sets that we could look at that either question or validate what we're seeing in channel dynamics? And the answer is yes. One such data set is the Viva Pulse data. So channel dynamics is about the HCP's perception of what we're doing with them, of that interaction, where Viva Pulse data is more about from the industry side on what we're sending outwards. So we can see here that Australia looks relatively consistent with much of the European markets. We rely really heavily still on in-person interactions, although proportionately our emails are a little bit higher than a lot of Europe. And this is the thing that, again, I just can't get my head around when we look at the figure on the right. Any surprises there? So despite this massive uptick in volume that we're seeing in channel dynamics, this isn't affecting open rates and click rates. And I've got some hypotheses for that I'll share shortly, but also keen to hear yours as well. So I talked a little bit about, at the beginning, about evolution, and perhaps there's some lessons there about where we're at as an industry that could be driving some of this change. And we've heard a lot about this meeting, about evolving how we interact with healthcare professionals, utilising new technology. And I'm the only one from Gilead in the room, so I can say, we're amongst friends. We got some new tech, tools recently that through one campaign I was able to trigger 1/3 of the total email volume that we've ever sent. So it's really easy, really cheap, and that was targeted, segment-driven, etc. But the volume of emails that we can trigger with a single click now is just off the charts. So as we're evolving to increasing automation, we need to make sure that we're basing that on accurate and complete data sets. because this is what will surely drive down NPS if we're sending the wrong message through the wrong channel at the wrong time. So I've taken this slide from a Viva presentation, many of you may have seen it before, which talks a little bit about that evolution. So I think we're probably, I'm going to be purposely vague, somewhere around here, but we're heading sort of over here. So in my experience at least, I reckon we're somewhere around the omnichannel place at the moment, and we're going through this period of evolution and change, and that also introduces a number of risks. We need to make sure that our systems are set up that while they're enabled to send a lot of things at once, that we're doing it with purpose and being mindful of the prescriber's inbox. So what are my key takeaways from you today? For you today, it's yes, the interactions have increased. That has had an impact on GP perception of the value that we bring, and for me, that's ringing a lot of alarm bells. And there is, as I've said already, this value in taking a longitudinal view. If that's the risk, what's the opportunity for us? Well, look, we need to really understand what drives quality. We've got a bit of a paradox in this data set, which is suggesting that usefulness is remaining high despite NPS falling. Can we be more strategic and considered on what we trigger and when? Are we using digital channels in supplement to those that are the majority of our work, which still remains face-to-face? We've talked a little bit about at this meeting the idea of relevance being the new reach. So how are we using the data that we've got around preference to ensure that the communications we're having are bang on and remain useful and are recommended by our prescribers to other prescribers? So what's the risk? Well, the clear one here is digital fatigue. There is this paradox, as I've mentioned, about fatigue and engagement rates, and there is, in my mind at least, a bit of a question about the NPS, the mathematical methodology of it. But then also another question arises in my mind when I look at particularly that Viva Pulse data about bot opens. So that's server-driven opens of our emails that look to our systems like a genuine open. And I think that might be artificially inflating open rates. So my call out to you is, while we're going through this period of evolution, going to hyper-personalized content, let's not muck this up, because we'll muck it up for everybody. Let's be mindful of what we're sending, because consent is precious and it's an increasingly hard-won thing. So let's evolve with purpose. So what I'm suggesting is we do less of that and more of this. So no email cannons, please. And that way we can conserve emails, inboxes for genuinely valuable content. Thank you for your attention.